Chapter 1. In the Valley of the Mountains, there you'll find a city of Lugs Ridge tucked away in its rolling hills. If you weren't purposely looking for it, then you might never find it. 800 miles away, an old orange Pinto spilling with luggage and a trailer barely holding onto the car's sag-a-bump, a term Paul and Pat at Peascoober coined for any car that has a bumper barely attached yet unwilling to fall off, made its way on a new journey. Paul and Pat sat in the back seat of the car, crammed in between bags and books. Pat unfolded a map of the countryside and set it on some of the books he placed on his lap for a makeshift table. With a pencil, he drew a circle with a sad face where their old house was and put an X where they were to end up. He started to draw a dotted line on the map to show their travels, but also did it to keep record of how many times they would get off course before making it to the end of their journey. Having Philip Peascoober, a directionally challenged man, drive was sure to make for a longer ride than any normal person wanted. Paul and Pat had a bet as to how many times they would get lost before getting to Lugs Ridge. Paul's mom Phoebe took the time in the car to start filling out paperwork for the new school the boys would be attending. She didn't realize it, but she would spell their names out loud when writing. Paul kept hearing her say the letter P over and over. If it wasn't bad enough to have the last name Peascoober, did everyone in the family also have to have their first name start with the letter P? Paul knew that families usually have kids and pets, or for some, there may even be adopted imaginary sloths, and yet every one of them was going to need a name, and a good name at that. There are 26 letters in the alphabet, and his mom and dad couldn't veer one letter to the right or left of the P? What about O, or Q, or the ever so popular T that can start great words like terrific, terrible, triumphant, or Tommy, Timmy, Tony, or Thor? Yeah, Thor. Now that is a Thorific name. Seriously, with so much variety in the world, why stick with P's? Pat was one grade behind Paul in school, so they shared the same friends and sometimes the same teachers. They thought that sharing teachers could be good or bad, depending on how the teacher remembered Paul from the year before. Last year, Paul got caught eating a glue stick during class. He and his best friend Aubrey were always thinking of things to lighten the mood in the institution, as they like to call it. This kind of behavior was refreshing to their classmates, as it made the school day go by quicker, but it wasn't always appreciated by their teachers. Aubrey, bored, reached into her desk and pulled out a glue stick. She was acting like it was a popsicle and started to pretend to lick it. Paul thought this was funny, but had to take it a bit farther. He also got out his glue stick, but instead of pretending, he actually bit into the pasty white mess as if it were a piece of candy. He quickly spit it back out onto the floor and started laughing and coughing at the same time. This got the attention of Miss Albright, a new teacher just graduated from university. She quickly walked between the rows of desks to the corner where the laughing was coming from. The kids heard her shoes clip-clopping to the back of the room. She didn't notice the chunk of white paste on the floor and stepped on it, causing her to slide as if she was ice skating. Her arms flailed in the air, and she let out a scream, trying with all her might to not hit the floor. Catching herself on a desk, she regained her composure. Looking down, she saw the name, Peascoober. There she saw Paul. He was looking up at her with a sheepish grin, as the evidence of what he did stuck to his face like butter. Aubrey in the class started to giggle more. Miss Albright, shocked at what just happened, and surprised to see Paul's face covered in paste, shrieked, "Oh, Peascoober! Go to the bathroom at once and clean your face off, young man!" That little shenanigan got Paul the letter P on the chalkboard and cost him his recess. But getting the class to laugh was worth it to him. It was Miss Albright's first year teaching, and had they stayed in the Flatlands, there would have been a good chance that Pat would have had her for a teacher the next year. Burning a bad impression of the oldest Peascoober boy into the cranium of a teacher wasn't something that would help his brother have an easy time the following year. It was probably good that they were moving, thought Paul. Pat continued to draw patiently on the map. A few dots and dashes here and there. It started out just fine, as it's hard to get lost in the Flatlands. All the roads are pretty straight, but once they left the area, things started rapidly changing. Pat had found his pencil going up and down and in circles and then cutting back again, to where he wondered if his dad was getting lost on purpose just to see what kind of picture Pat would end up with at the end of the trip. So far, the map looked like a long string of spaghetti that coiled and turned every which direction. Paul held his head up with his fist as he sat staring out the window. He thought the car ride was just as boring as his summer had been. Close to 100 days of what should have been the best time of the year ended up feeling like an eternity of boredom. He was sure that all of his friends back in the flatlands were having some kind of adventure, but not him. No, his mom and dad didn't plan a vacation because they had to sell the house and get everything packed up. There was no time to go to any water park, and even if there was, all of the swimsuits were in a mix of unmarked cardboard boxes. He and Patty were given strict instruction to not unpack anything that was already packed. Had he not begged and pleaded to keep their bikes from being packed up early, he would literally have had nothing to do as they waited to move. Paul started to think about having to wake up early for school again and getting pushed into a routine he didn't care for. He was now thinking it rude for adults to make their kids wake up early and go to school all day, only to have to come back home, be tired, and then have homework to get finished. By the time you finally adjust to it, the school then turns around and releases you from their grip, jolting you back into a tailspin of summer break with no schedule whatsoever. All the work you had to do to get used to getting up in the morning and not feeling half dead was erased. The car ride seemed to go on forever, hour after hour. Paul had finally had enough and blurted out, "I'm sure everyone else's summer has been full of adventure. All the while, I've been stuck with Boredom Bird pestering me all hours of the day. It seems to follow me around like a family pet. Not that we have any. Don't you see it? It's following us. I was hoping to leave it on my windowsill back at the house. It would wake me up every morning with an annoying tap, tap, tap on the window just loud enough that I would crack my eyes open. Once I saw the sunlight, it was all over, and I couldn't go back to sleep. I would glare in its direction as I watched it sit its little behind right down on the ledge of my window. Looking out, I would see the empty backyard, and it would say with a smirked grin, 'Well, there's nothing for you to do today, and you're awake. You're welcome.' Fully awake, I could hear the chirp of its boredom song singing so loud and annoying that I couldn't get it out of my head. 'How long can we make this day? Forever, 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 I say. There's nothing more for you to do except to sit and stare and stew. What are you to do? Ugh, I'm so bored, said Paul. Seriously, if I could catch this little pest, I would put it in a cage and lock it up forever. The family just listened to Paul's rant and kept to themselves as the car chugged along, adding more dots and dashes to Padded's map. Finally, Philip spoke up. He saw the sign for Lugs Ridge. Home sweet home, boys! Woohoo! We made it! Paul looked out and saw them passing an old wooden sign that barely shone the words of Lugs Ridge. It was weather-worn and looked as if no one took care of it. Oh, great! Our home is like an old western town. We will probably have no running water and have to fetch it from a well, thought Paul. Mr. Peascoober turned down a few side streets, then took a right turn on Peascoober Lane. There, he drove past 2 houses, then pulled into the next driveway. Greeting them was an old 2-story square home that had an observation tower in the center of the roof. This made the house look very tall. The shutters around the windows were hanging lopsided and looked as they may fall off the house at the slightest breeze. The paint was curled and peeling off the wood siding. The Peascoobers have finally arrived to take residence on Old Peascoober Lane, said Mr. Peascoober. Paul groaned, as the thought of another P word being associated with his name was just a bit more than he could handle. Out of the corner of his eye, Patty saw something big and furry run underneath the large wraparound porch, then disappear. Did you see that small bear go under the porch? Said Patty, as he pointed the direction of the house. Philip got out of the car and stood proud looking at the dilapidated home and said, Isn't it magnificent? It's a fixer-upper, a diamond in the rough. But don't worry, I'll get it into shape. Mrs. Peascoober, hearing Patty's comment about small bears, decided that her and the boys should not tear into the house just yet, but rather let Mr. Peascoober deal with any unwanted tenants that might need evicted before they stay their first night. She had seen a shoe store on the way into town and decided to take the boys to get their shoes for the start of the school year. They unhooked the trailer from the car and put all the luggage in the drive. Mr. Peascoober opened the trailer and a mountain of boxes came crashing out. Pettit found the box with all the sporting equipment. He went over to his dad and handed him a football helmet, a baseball bat, a golf club, and a tennis racket. Dad, you might want these. Mom says we will be back when you kick out the bears. Good luck, and don't die. Mr. Peascoober just stared at Pettit with a stunned look on his face and watched as the 3 Peascoobers got back in the car and drove off, leaving him there to fend for himself. Bears, ha, he muttered, but the more he thought about it, the more nervous he got. He rummaged through the box and found the rest of the football gear. Holding the undersized armor, he justified its protective quality over fitting. Better to be safe than sorry, he said to himself. His lips puckered out as he pushed on the small helmet over his head, crushing his cheeks. He headed toward the porch to see what he was up against. As he got close, a large furry ball with buck teeth came screeching out of its hole. Mr. Peascoober let out a high-pitched scream and took off running away from the oversized groundhog in hot pursuit of him. No doubt that if their neighbors would have saw him, they would think the Peascoobers to be a bit on the crazy side, as a grown man in kitty-sized sports gear was yelling at the top of his lungs and running away from the oversized rodent. Mrs. Peascoober and the boys were singing along with the radio as they pulled into the store parking lot. Lots of Shoes Shoe Store was having a sale that day with a buy one get one 9/16 off. Paul saw the sign. 9/16? Who does that? He blurted. They entered the store with excitement. There was something magical about getting new kicks. Paul and Pettit banked on the unwritten rule that whenever you got new shoes, they helped you run faster than you did before. They knew this because their dad had told them. They remember a few years ago when their dad decided to get them all the same kind of shoes to prove his theory. They were the latest tennis shoes on the market. They were called kangaroos and had 2 ultra-grip Velcro strips for non-slip action, and a zipper on the side that revealed a small pocket that could hold about 2 quarters. They came in several colors. Paul's shoes were blue, Pettit's shoes were red, and their dad's shoes were gray. They had put on their new shoes, and you could start to hear the invisible crowd in the stands cheering on the runners as they walked to the backyard. Their mom held a camera and stopwatch to catch the photo finish. Paul, Pettit, and their dad put a foot on the starting line, which was a tree root coming out of the ground. They peered ahead, then squinting their eyes, they looked at each other. Their dad was pulling the intimidation card as he looked at the boys mouthing the words, "Eat my dust." But Paul and Pettit was having none of it. They were ready to show their dad that he had nothing on their speed. Their mom shouted, "Runners, on your mark!" The 3 of them bent over and put their fingers to the grass. "Get set!" You could see Paul and Pettit's legs starting to bounce. "Go!" Paul was the first one off the tree root, and right behind him was Pettit, gaining within inches. Paul bounded toward his mom, determined to cross the finish line first. Mrs. Peascoober took the photo. Paul and Pettit crossed the line together and then fell into the grass, looking back toward the starting line. There, lying in the grass, they saw their dad on the ground. He had tripped halfway through the race. He was laughing and said that his shoes were so fast that his feet went right out from under him. The photo showed Paul winning by a nose. The boys were sure they proved their dad's theory that day. With this in mind, they scoured up and down the aisles, looking at all the new trends, taking in deep breaths of the new shoe smell that filled the store. Finally, Paul saw something that made his brain explode with excitement. Shoes that pump up like a basketball. He had to have them. There was no changing his mind. He tried them on and gave a few pumps and instantly felt like Hermes, the mythological god of speed, ready to beat anyone that challenged him to a race. He ran to Pettit to show how cool these shoes were. "Look, Pettit, these shoes will increase my speed from last year. Hit the pump 3 times and it tightens the shoe around my foot, making it easier to run. Last year, my shoes just lit up on the bottom, and with those, I could run like 50 miles an hour. So I'm sure with these new pumps, I can run even faster." Pettit, annoyed that Paul would think he found the fastest shoes, kept looking to find some good rivals against his brother's pick. Then he found them. Shoes that had springs in the front and wheels in the back. Their sleek design and color scheme screamed speed. He knew this would be a good pick for him and a good challenger to Paul. He put them on and started hopping on his toes and skating on his heels. From the initial Kangaroos race a few years back, Paul and Pettit would always race each other as soon as they had their new shoes to see how they performed that year. Paul was impressed with Pettit's choice, but was confident his was the best. As soon as their mom had paid for the shoes, the boys ripped open the boxes and put on their new kicks. They stepped outside the store and put their feet on a sidewalk line. They counted to 3 and raced to the nearest bench about 30 feet away. As soon as they got to the bench, Paul slowed up to catch his breath and noticed that Paddock kept rolling on the back of his heels. He looked like he was on a conveyor belt floating down the sidewalk. The race was so close that arguments would continue to arise about whose shoes were better. They made their way back to the tower house as Paul and Paddock started calling their new home. There was only a few weeks left of summer break, so the boys were doing their best to make the most of the summer before hearing the school bell and having to deal with being the new kids in town. Paul's mind started to wander to thoughts of their old school and their old friends, and he was thinking that they were now a lifetime away. The Peascoober family was determined to keep the boredom bird from perching on Paul's window for at least the last week of summer, so they decided to explore as much new ground as they could before school had to start. Phoebe thought the city park would be a good place, so they all hopped onto their bikes. There, Paul and Paddock quickly made new friends, the Crocker siblings, Wendy and Charlie. Wendy was the same age as Paul, and Charlie was the same age as Paddock. Just like the Peascoober boys, Wendy and Charlie seemed very close to each other, thick as thieves, as some might say. The kids seemed to hit it off right away. Paul liked Wendy's smile and found himself trying to impress her and not sure why. She kind of reminded him of Aubrey back in the Flatlands. They seemed to click, and he was feeling a little more excited to start the new school year after meeting her. Paddock had taken his two-way radio, hoping to cross another person's frequency. Much to his surprise, Charlie also had a two-way radio and was doing the same thing. The two quickly started talking to each other and became friends. The Peascoobers were starting to get comfortable with the idea of Lugs Ridge becoming their new home.